Michigan Public's reporting is powered by you. If you haven't yet, you can support our audio stream, website, and podcast during our winter member drive. All new monthly gifts will be doubled right now through the Resilience for the Future match. Make your gift at michiganpublic.org/donate.
From Michigan Public, this is It's Just Politics. I'm Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
In Michigan and across the country, data centers are triggering backlash. These are the huge facilities that promise community investment and jobs, but demand enormous amounts of electricity, water, and very often state tax incentives.
What began as a race to lure tech dollars and economic development has morphed into broad political fights in communities across the state. Saline Township, Howell Township, Kalkaska.
But what's so interesting, Republicans and Democrats in Michigan haven't really staked out specific party-aligned stances.
Yeah, it's not so much conservative versus liberal, but just these competing notions of how to manage the growing need for electricity to power an AI future.
With concerns about how they'll affect the environment and costs, like electric affordability.
And much of the political class is still figuring out how these massive facilities fit into the state's economic future, if they should fit at all.
On today's show, why you are hearing so much right now about data centers, the unsettled politics surrounding them, and what Michigan can learn from other states currently having this very same debate.
So data centers are seemingly everywhere now.
That's Ben Green. He's assistant professor in the School of Information at the University of Michigan studying the issue.
They have, in the span of just a couple months, gone from a somewhat esoteric topic that very few people knew about to something that is regularly on the front page of major national newspapers.
But why? We asked Ben that question and much more.
Essentially, this is because the AI industry need a lot of computational resources to train and deploy generative AI tools. ChatGPT, Sora, they require huge amounts of computational resources and capacity and data. Storing that data, training these models, and then running the tasks that users provide require tons and tons of computation. And so that requires all of these new facilities that these companies are trying to develop.
And remind us who is pushing for them.
So the major players pushing for this are the major AI companies. So OpenAI, Meta, Google, and so on. They want to own or at least have access to these hyperscale massive data centers so that they can have the resources to train and run their own systems.
So that is who is pushing for them. But the need is there because folks are using more AI. Is that fair?
Well, I would push back on that a little bit, actually, because the development of the data centers is massively outpacing the actual genuine demand for these systems. And the costs, the financial investments that are going into these data centers is also far beyond any revenue or profit that these companies are generating. So certainly there is a growing demand for AI tools, partly generated by the companies pushing these things onto us. And often you don't have a choice, right? Like when you search Google now, you have an AI overview. So that is new AI demand, but many people would actually prefer to just have a classic Google search without that AI system running without an option to get rid of it. So there is this growing demand, but the companies are really trying to make this proactive investment to push data centers at this incredibly rapid pace, well beyond any immediate demand that is there. I think there's this sort of arms race between companies where one AI company doesn't want to be left behind if some other company has more data centers, more compute capacity than they do. They're worried about getting left behind.
And with that in mind, the arms race that's happening with these companies, but is it fair to say it's also happening among states in terms of the larger incentives that they're offering to try to get data centers into their states?
Absolutely. Now there's the question of where all of these data centers going to go. To a large extent, these companies are really kind of blanketing the nation with pitches for data centers. And now states are competing against one another. There's all these promises of economic development and sort of having a foothold in the future AI economy, which is attractive. And so states want to bring data centers to their own local communities. And so one of the main ways they're doing that is passing tax breaks where they're saying, hey, we will give you some discount or some break on the taxes that you would pay as an incentive to come here. And Michigan passed tax breaks just last year as a way to incentivize data center development here.
Do data centers bring spin-off economic benefits, like, say, auto plants or other big manufacturing facilities, which states also incentivize and compete for?
Well, I think one of the big differences between data centers and some of those examples you mentioned is that there's much less of a direct stake or benefit to the local community. So there's a lot of backlash now against data centers because they actually bring a lot of costs in terms of higher electricity prices and environmental costs, but they actually don't bring the types of economic and community pillar that some of those other, an auto plant might bring. So data centers bring very few jobs. So if they're not showing up and then employing many people in the community, which creates that sort of ecosystem, there might be, in a massive data center, you might only have 25 full-time employees.
Ben, you co-authored this recent paper titled, "What Happens When Data Centers Come to Town?" Answer. What happens?
Well, there are a lot of costs for communities. I mean, in many ways, I think of data centers as they bring a lot of costs, and really the companies have structured their deals with the states in ways that externalize most of these costs onto residents and utility consumers rather than owning it themselves as the tech companies. So one of the biggest ones that is capturing a lot of attention is rising electricity prices. Data centers consume a ton of electricity, so that puts strain on the grid, and then that is creating increases in electricity prices all across the country. And there's been trends where you can see that the closer you are to data centers, the more there are in your region, the more your electricity prices are going up. So that's often the thing that people notice the most. That's like just a basic affordability issue hitting their pocketbooks at the end of every month. There are also a lot of environmental costs. So all of that electricity has to come from somewhere. And often then that means that fossil fuel plants are staying open. Data centers also use a lot of water. They need water primarily for cooling. Doing all of that computation creates a lot of heat, so you need water for cooling. And so they're draining water from reservoirs, from rivers, kind of depends exactly how they're set up, but that's another cost. And then on the flip side, they don't really bring jobs, so you're not getting that direct benefit of economic development. And they do provide tax revenue, but the tax revenue is actually quite a bit less than you might think because of these tax breaks. So the states are definitely competing with one another. When I talk to policymakers, I mean, they're definitely will say things like, we don't want to miss out. If it doesn't come here, they'll go to some other state. But from my perspective, that seems fine. Why do we competing for a type of infrastructure that's not actually beneficial to the community or to the local environment?
But don't they have to go somewhere?
Well, I would say that there will be data centers that are constructed. I think that the pace of development is incredibly massive. So there are so many being developed, far more than I think is actually needed. And, there are now these conversations about whether we're in an economic bubble. And that is primarily driven by data center development. So, these companies are pouring trillions of dollars into infrastructure investments, do not actually make profit. So there's a concern. I think that the pace is way too high. But there's also a question of who bears all of those costs, right? So the tech companies are, and one of the reasons they are able to build so many data centers is because they are essentially able to pass off many of the costs to the community, right? So they are creating a big strain on the grid, but a lot of those costs get passed on to consumers rather than the companies doing it themselves. So I think it's important for states and policymakers to say, if a data center is going to come, we have to be very strict in terms of you really have to own all of the funding for any resource or infrastructure upgrades. There needs to be a lot more transparency. I mean, these companies, the data centers are incredibly opaque. They fight tooth and claw to withhold even basic information about how much electricity or water they use. So again, there may be some data centers in Michigan or any other state, but they should be developed in a way that is honoring the community's well-being and wishes and invites them into the process and actually creates benefits for them rather than forcing it down their throats.
So why do data centers and the companies that are creating them, why do they have this political sway where so many politicians and states want them?
I think at the state level, a lot of governors and state policymakers, they're sort of I think, used to a particular mode of economic development where you attract corporate investment and that brings jobs and tax revenue. I think for a long time, there was a very strong pitch about creating jobs, and that pitch is still there. There is this sort of broad hype around AI, and AI is the future. AI is changing everything, and we want to get a piece of that. We want to have a piece of the future of the economy. And so I think they're just kind of seeing that, and there's a little bit of this sense of, AI hype and FOMO that, and there's a ton of lobbying from these companies, right? They are pushing very compelling pitches about why a data center will be beneficial, and they have just the upper hand in terms of these arguments compared to the communities.
Ben, finally, if you were advising elected officials or lawmakers right now who are having these conversations and these debates, what would you tell them?
I would tell them that vocally supporting data centers is creating a huge vulnerability. Being vocally at least skeptical, if not oppositional towards data centers, is something that I think can bring you a lot of support. And we've seen this just in the elections last month in Virginia. A lot of, at both the governor level, but also the local level, opposition to data centers was a huge issue that came up. Virginia has the most data centers of any state in the country. And residents are upset. I mean, especially this plays into conversations about cost of living and affordability with the electricity prices. And we saw that that was a pretty popular issue at both the state and local level there. In Georgia, there was utility commissioners races that swung to Democrats for the first time, in large part because those Democrats ran on opposing data centers. And so I think that this topic is only going to get more heated over the next couple of years, and more people are realizing that data centers are close to them because more data centers are being built. They don't like the impacts of these data centers. They don't really like the companies that are pushing them. And I think for someone like Governor Whitmer, it's a real vulnerability in the state now that she has been quite vocally positive about data centers, including the OpenAI project in Saline, which has been this huge fight. And I go to these communities and talk to residents. They're aware that the governor is in support of these things. And even if they are Democrats and have supported her in the past, that is a huge red flag to them. That is something they feel that she is on the side of these massive companies against the community. And I think for any politician who's been taking these very pro-data center stances, if they are running future races, it's going to be a concern and something that a lot of residents will be worked up against them for that reason.
That's Ben Green. He's assistant professor in the School of Information at the University of Michigan. Ben, thanks so much for the time.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So as we just heard, it is not just Michigan where these political debates are happening. These conversations about the future of data centers are happening across the country. And as Ben said, there are states that are further along in the debate than Michigan, where decisions about data centers have already had these electoral consequences.
David Chen is national correspondent at the New York Times. His story this past weekend pretty much picks up where Ben left off, the actual political consequences. David, hi.
Hi, great to be on. Thank you.
So your story, The New Price of Eggs, the political shocks of data centers and electric bills, you found that data centers aren't just seeming to split evenly across political divides in a number of states.
Yeah, you're right that it doesn't fall into the usual camps, I would say, when it comes to political issues. I focused on Georgia because that's a state where voters can elect members of the state's Public Service Commission, and they're the folks who regulate utilities.
And what did you find?
Basically, what started out as sort of a referendum on people's rising electric bills became this litmus test of data centers. And I think it's really emerged as kind of a sleeper issue. And I spent time in a couple of places, actually, where data centers have been a pressing issue and really made a difference in the way people voted. They're both in a very conservative county, and in one case, there was a data center that was approved without, many people knowing about it beforehand, and I think folks got really spooked and concerned about the lack of transparency in the process, the inability to kind of weigh in or talk about potential impacts on water and other resources. And by the time residents in another community got wind of another data center that was being proposed, they really rallied, they attended meetings, and it was very clear that it was not a group of, say, professional activists or organizers or environmentalists or others. I mean, there were a lot of Republicans who joined that coalition. And so I think that has kind of really transcended the usual party affiliations. And so when this election came up for the State Public Service Commission, which has been held by Republicans for the last 15, 20 years, they did not think twice about bucking their party label and voting for the Democrats in the race to send a message. Even though they didn't know anything about the Democrats, they just wanted to send a message. And the fact that the Democratic underdogs upset the incumbents by 20 points, 25 points, I mean, was just a huge shockwave to the political establishment there. And outside of Georgia, it's become an issue in places like South Carolina and Florida, where some Republican legislators have not been afraid to challenge energy companies that want to build new power plants and pipelines that they say are really important to accommodate data centers. In Virginia, in the election just a few weeks ago, there were some candidates, Democrats, who talked about data centers as kind of a key plank. And a couple of them rode those concerns about data centers to upset victories. So it's an issue where the typical politics are not necessarily aligning in the way you might think. And that probably speaks again to what you guys are experiencing in Michigan and in the Great Lakes in terms of data centers really eyeing whatever open patches of land they can find to put these huge, huge facilities.
So, David, it's not, in your reporting at least, in these other states necessarily Republican versus Democrat, but perhaps more establishment versus grassroots, big tech versus communities.
I think that is definitely true in a lot of these cases. There's definitely a lot of grassroots advocacy and concerns where you've got an interesting alliance of folks working together because they have those concerns about how their neighborhoods and communities look like. And that's not a Democratic or Republican thing per se. So yes, it's definitely very interesting kind of atypical mix that you're finding around the country.
You know, it seems like so much of today's politics is nationalized with all of those, powerful partisan forces. And it feels like data centers buck that trend.
I think to some degree, I think a lot of the folks I talk to almost viewed this as kind of like a zoning or a planning board issue. They don't pay as much attention to national politics. They're not aware of balance of power in a state house in Virginia. They're just concerned, it seems, for the most part, with having their voices heard on a big project that could really shape their identity or their community. And a number of them did say that they're not opposed to data centers inherently. I think it's really more a matter of if they are placed in, say, an industrial area and a place that is zoned properly and the public is aware of it and has a chance to weigh in on it, they are okay with that. I think they just feel, again, that the big forces, whether it's behind closed doors or in the corridors of power, are kind of pulling another one over on them, and they're just pretty frustrated with that. And so that's kind of an example of that grassroots, very local advocacy that really is not directly a response to politics being nationalized, as we all come to expect, but rather still quite local when it comes to certain issues like data centers.
That is David Chen, national correspondent at the New York Times, focusing on state legislatures and state policymaking. David, thanks so much for your reporting and for your time.
Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.
And if you are looking for more information and reporting about data centers, well, first, we are going to link to David's story. We are going to link to Ben's paper at michiganpublic.org/itsjustpolitics. And at michiganpublic.org, you can find all of the Michigan Public newsroom stories about where data centers are possibly being built, the protests surrounding them, public hearings that are happening. Again, the website website, michiganpublic.org. And while you're there, if you haven't already, you can sign up for the It's Just Politics newsletter. That is where we dig into the politics behind the policy, like data centers, to really understand what is going on in our state. Sign up now and we'll be in your inbox every Friday afternoon. michiganpublic.org. And that is It's Just Politics for today. I am Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
Let's talk again next week.